Welcome to the Informed Simplicity podcast. I'm Dr. Jordan Hayers here with Dr. Julia Conroy. This is our Polyvagal series. In this series, we're taking a shared journey to learn more about how stress impacts our bodies from a polyvagal perspective. If you're a therapist or counselor, you can earn CEs by listening. Check the description to learn how you can listen and earn. At the beginning of each episode, we like to review the basics of polyvagal theory. Polyvagal theory tells us that our bodies have three ways of responding, all depending on how safe or threatened we feel. First, when we feel safe or only a little challenged, our bodies are designed to seek connection. This is when our bodies are primed for growth and physical healing. But sometimes we face outright challenges. When this happens, our heart rate and breathing speed up, and we go into our second response, fight or flight. This is when our bodies are primed for movement. This is also when we are prone to irritation and anxiety. And if we're facing what feels like a life-threatening situation, our heart rate and breathing slow way down, and we use our third response, freezing. There are different types of freezing. Some of the types of freezing are things like going numb, fainting, feeling depressed, or having chronic fatigue and lethargy. However our bodies respond to challenges and threats, the important thing to remember is all of these systems are working together to maximize protection for our most vulnerable systems. In short, our bodies are designed to keep us safe. To understand the relationship between these three responses and our physical and mental health, we're looking at the extensive research on how stress impacts our bodies. Our main text for this is Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
And today, I'm journey by talking about the immune system. And so in this chapter, Sapolsky really talks about how the immune system works, what the links are between immune responses and stress, and kind of the implications that this body of research has. So we're going to be kind of following that map today as we walk through that. Jordan, are you ready to talk immune system?
I never thought you'd ask me that question, Julia. Are you ready to talk?
It's about time.
System? It's about time, yes. Yeah, I'm really ready. To me, the immune system is fascinating because it's this part of our body that we can really see, learn,
Mm-hmm.
And I think humans have two main superpowers, right? One is our power to connect and work together. And one is our power to learn. And so I'm super excited about this. And yeah, I think it's just a really cool thing that our bodies can do.
Oh, absolutely. And so regardless of where we fall on that spectrum of how much we know about the immune system, about how it learns and the ways that it does that and the different kind of approaches it has to that learning, we're going to kind of break that down today. But before we jump into it, I do want to acknowledge that discovering and exploring this link between the nervous system or brain functioning and the immune system is relatively new. Relatively new in research means only a few decades old, just to clarify.
It's not like TikTok new. It's like,
yeah, it's, oh gosh, nowhere near TikTok new. And so with that, we want to appreciate this is a really growing field, but also kind of acknowledge that this is kind of something that was thought to be distinct and separate for so long. How can I have any sort of control over my immune functioning? How can that adjust according to what I'm seeing and perceiving? And so just kind of acknowledging that this is relatively new, but that makes it so much fun to explore, especially because our immune functioning just touches every aspect of life. Over the past few years, as we've seen more attention called to it with COVID and with this global pandemic. It's exciting to kind of think about how stress impacts that, but also the role that polyvagal theory could play here. So a lot of this research initially was kind of founded on
Can I just say
these.
something
Oh
really
yeah,
important here?
please.
Because I think what you're saying is so important. You know, when we first talked about starting this podcast, the heart behind it was empowerment, for people to be empowered
Mm-hmm.
through knowledge, to know about their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I was born, no one handed me a user manual for how my heart works or my immune system works or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think especially now, in order for people to make informed decisions, this topic is really, really relevant. You know, and
Mm-hmm.
hopefully, best case scenario by the time that this comes out, will be through the worst of the pandemic, right?
Mm.
Knock on
Oh,
wood.
I like that option.
But in order for people to make informed decisions, they need to know about how their body works. And in this day and age, they need to know about how their immune system works. So I think this is super relevant, and I love what you're saying.
Yeah, it is. It's empowering to understand how my body works. And we can get, especially now, information from 1,000 different
So
sources.
many sources.
So with that, we're really just looking to say, okay, what is kind of the review from this body of research, right? What is kind of established? We're taking a really simplified approach to that. We're not going to get too far into the weeds, but especially as clinicians, as lay people that are not looking to study the immune systems with their whole life, what are ways and pieces of this that we can pull to feel empowered in that sense, to understand especially the role that stress can play on that functioning. And so I'm excited to dive in.
Let's do it. I'm
And I
ready.
just want to start with with some like initial ways that we found, right, just to establish this link. And I want to, the best way to establish this credibility, right, is by just like a story of how kind of this link was developed between, okay, maybe there is a connection between our nervous system and the immune system, was small things like when we wave an artificial rose in front of someone who's allergic to real roses, they have an allergic response, right? And things like that, examples like that shows, okay, that's not all biological, like that's fake. That's a fake rose. It's not causing this immune response directly, but the way that the nervous system is interpreting, right, and kind of putting to work this fear that I know I should have around roses lets me know I should kind of panic here. And so
Yeah.
it's these small incidents like that that kind of establish, okay, maybe there is something more here.
Yeah. I was blown away by this, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think the way that we sort of think about it is like conditioned immunosuppression, right? Sort of this thing that the nervous system the immune system through repeated exposure to things can be conditioned to this, can be conditioned to respond in a certain way. And I remember, long story short, when I was a kid and I was playing t-ball and I started rubbing my eyes and I rubbed them so much that I had to be pulled out of the game. We went to the emergency room because my eyes were so swollen. I was like 5 or 6, right? And that was the first time that like the doctor told me that I had seasonal allergies. So for me, this is like such a real thing. You know what I mean? Like, ooh.
Yeah.
So learning all this stuff, I was like, this is so interesting. And I think for me, the most interesting story was the rat story, right? Sapolsky loves his baboons and he loves his rats. And he talks about how I think they were doing tests on rats and their immune system. I think that's what it was. And they would put basically poison in their sugar water. And they'd study these rats and how they would respond. And then they were done. And they stopped giving the rats the poison, but they kept giving them the sugar water. And the rats continued to get sick. And they didn't know why this was happening. And what they then later found out through subsequent studies and bringing in some specialists was the sugar water was a cue for the rat's immune system to basically
Mhm.
turn off now, right?
Mhm.
And it sort of
Yeah.
opened up this whole sort of world of like, wait, like our immune systems can be conditioned, which is a kind of a crazy thing, at least to people like me who, aren't medical doctors. So I just think this is so wild.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So it does. It shows this link. And again, we always want to make the distinction. It's not under this conscious control, right? I can't like decide to tell my immune system to like, okay, shut off. I'm good for right now. Or like, let's go. Like, I need you to kick in here. But it's adjusting its sensitivity and responsiveness below the surface of the autonomic nervous system, the one that's outside of our control, has an impact on how effective it can be. So kind of these stories, these examples really show us kind of the link that those two have. It's not purely biological. It's not purely just this physical response, but there is some sort of perception and nervous system role that's being played in that. So we're excited to kind of jump into that today.
Yeah.
Before we do, we want to start just kind of with laying the foundation of what immune functioning is. Right, because we know that's important. We know it's what keeps us from getting sick, but really the primary responsibility of this system is to defend the human body against infectious viruses, bacteria, fungi, parasites, to really be able to protect the body in that sense, but doing it specifically by defending against those things that aren't supposed to be there.
So could we say that this is like the body's military?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the perfect comparison there.
Okay. Okay, perfect. I always think of that old movie, Osmosis Jones, where like the white blood cell was like a cop and he had to like hunt down the bad
Love
guys.
that movie. That's an amazing movie.
Yeah,
It's
why
this
didn't
is
that
our
have a
official
sequel?
plug. I hope that this has a link in our maybe we can get sponsored
Maybe
by
we can get sponsored
Osmosis
by
Jones.
Osmosis
Yeah.
Jones. I'm
Oh,
sure
we
they're
would
gonna like
love.
reboot it any
Yeah,
day now, right?
as they
Make it into
should.
a trilogy. Make it
A
into
COVID
a
edition. That's what the world needs right now. But it is like as entertaining as it was to watch, like it got a lot of things right as it does. It acts as this patrol, this military, this police force, right, going around our body, making sure that whatever's not supposed to be there is taken care of as quickly as possible so that, again, this idea of homeostasis that we could keep coming back to so that the body can function in a way that it's most optimal, that it's most effective, and that we can really thrive. And so how does it do this? The immune system is really comprised primarily of white blood cells. And this is just a really delicately balanced systems that work together. There's a few different types. We're not going to like get into all those, don't worry. But really all of them kind of have a different role and function, but they're within this, but primarily looking to discern what is supposed to be here and what's an invader that we need to destroy. Like what belongs to the body and like should be functioning and should be a part of this system, and what do we need to eliminate in order to make sure that it's functioning at its best. So when we see things like allergic reactions or even various autoimmune diseases, what those are really a result of is the body has mislabeled uh, that allergen or that, part of the body as something that's harmful to it when it's really not. So it's the result of, I've identified this as something that's harmful, something that's not supposed to be there, something that has the potential to be dangerous when it actually is, in an autoimmune disease, it actually is helpful. It actually is supposed to be there. Or with allergic reaction, something that is pretty neutral, pretty harmless, the body identifies it as something that can be dangerous.
Yeah. So what are some examples of this, right? What are some examples of autoimmune diseases?
Yeah, so this is, MS, juvenile diabetes, that those examples where the body has really targeted either an organ or a type of cell in the body and has said, okay, this isn't supposed to be here. We need to attack this. We need to shut this down.
Yeah.
And that obviously impairs the functioning that it is supposed to have within the body, where it's not able to function in the way that it's meant to.
Yeah. Okay. So things like that, which is kind of wild, right? It's like, wow, sometimes in these moments, our bodies mistake ourselves for the threat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is called acquired immunity, right?
Yeah, that this is a result of that acquired immunity where the body kind of develops a really specific targeted immunity after some sort of realization that this isn't supposed to be here.
Yeah. But there's another type of immunity that we have that I wasn't aware was also a defense. Can you talk about that too?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's called innate immunity.
It is. It's this innate immunity, and this is a more generalized response. Okay, so if acquired immunity is really saying, this is the specific thing we're going after, like I've recognized what this looks like, I know how this is put together, let's round up everything else that looks like this and kind of get a game plan together of how to shut it down. This innate immunity is far more generalized, that it isn't looking to target something specifically, but this is something where we see like when the nose starts running, right? And it's like ejecting, right? Some things that the body says, this isn't good, this shouldn't be here, that's more of a generalized response. It's not looking to get rid of one specific bacteria, one specific virus, but it's more this generalized response that's developed within humans to make sure that we have kind of this baseline level of immunity.
Yeah, the way that I try to picture it is if acquired immunity is like, the National Guard and like the police force, then innate immunity is like, the walls, the rivers, sort of the natural and, sort of built borders that you might have in like a country.
Yeah, I think that's a really good metaphor for it, that those still serve a purpose, right? In keeping that country safe and making sure that we're prevented against this sense of invasion or attack, but it's not targeting anyone in particular. It's just kind of more generally there and established.
Perfect. Okay. So look, this is also, of the Polyvagal series. So it doesn't look like on the surface this relates back to polyvagal theory, but does it?
Of course it always does. We're too biased around here to say anything else.
I wish people on the audio could see her face in that moment. It was priceless.
I'm like, how dare you ask? And so what we're really looking at when we think about that polyvagal connection that might be here with regard to the immune system. So when we've talked about, right, these three branches within the vagus nerve, and the most developed of those being the social engagement system. So when that is activated, when we are in states of safety, whether in that socially, that's physically, like I feel this sense of safety where I am, our immune system is able to release a protein. These specific proteins are called cytokines, which actually turn off inflammation within the body. And so whenever we're threatened, whenever we're in fight or flight, the body then releases proteins that actually turn on inflammation, right, and cause more of this response. So you see this link here that when we're rested, when we're socially engaged, when we're picking up those signals of safety, inflammation is deactivated, right? Our bodies are in more of a state of rest. Whereas when we are activated, are in those moments, that's when we see inflammation increase.
Yeah, I think this was one of the things that as I was sort of reading this, I think it was very initially confusing, right? Because there's a lot of talk now about like the cytokine sort of theory of COVID, that some of the main damage done to bodies is when the cytokine storm hits. And when I was looking into this, there's an article that Portis and some colleagues released called Polyvagal Theory and the Global Cytokine Theory of Safety and Threat. And basically what they were saying was there are two types of cytokines. So cytokines are just sort of like the protein that is released that controls inflammation. And sometimes it's released in a way that inhibits inflammation. Sometimes it's released in a way that encourages inflammation. And that process is regulated by the social engagement system. And so on the one hand, it's kind of like, it's kind of confusing, right? Because cytokines apparently do both. But on the other hand, it's like, I think it's kind of cool that our body is that nuanced, you know, and that it's that responsive to how safe we feel. Like that's just sort of a wild thing that, again, like you said multiple times, is that neuroception. It's happening outside of our perception on our nervous system, when our nervous system is detecting threat or safety. So to me, that was like, this is so cool. This is so cool.
Absolutely. It also, I think, highlights, how devastating 2020 and years after that have been, where the very thing that we need to keep, that we're being told keeps us safe, is to distance and is to take space and is to quarantine in a sense. And that actually impairs right, my body's capacity to protect itself. And that's why, just appreciating the complexity of this disease and the impact that it's had on our culture, but on, the world. It really helps us appreciate, wow, this has a devastating effect. Even when we're doing the very thing that we're being told will keep us most safe, it also has this impact on our immune system to be separate and to be distant in these ways. It appreciating it there too.
Yeah, Portis also has a paper on this about the paradoxical need of our bodies right now. And I wrote a blog post about it. I'll link to it in the show notes. But it's really sort of devastating, the paradox that we're in. I remember reading about, and forgive me if I've told you the story before, Julia. I remember reading about in the late 1800s when they sort of discovered microbes, right? And what then happened after, was initially people were like, that's ridiculous. like they're little tiny bugs that run around and like make people sick. Yeah. So that's not a real thing. And then they finally believed that it was a real thing. And the medical establishment sort of really pendulum swung to the point that in the early 1900s, you would often see hospitals not let parents visit their kids because they didn't want to spread contagious and infectious diseases. Well, that helped up to a point. But then when you had all these kids who weren't allowed to have their parents around, they got even more sick and people couldn't figure it out. They were like, what is going on here? And it was the fact that these kids were isolated. Their nervous systems were stressed and taxed. And because they didn't have that social connection, that social engagement system wasn't being activated, then they had more problems. And so you really see how nuanced our bodies are here and how we're sort of in a paradox. We need relationships, not just for our mental health, but also for our physical health. But also when it comes to things like infectious diseases, like what we need is distance. And so it's just, it's sort of the classic war between a need for connection and a need for protection.
Absolutely. And just appreciating that and all the different ways that can look, outside of COVID too, with people, going through cancer treatments, people going, through any autoimmune issues where it's like, it's my doctor's telling me it's best for me to take that space and to quarantine and to isolate in these ways, and just recognizing the effects that can have. Right. And I think it kind of awakens in me of, okay, what are some ways that we can get creative and getting them that sense of connection in a way that's safe? Because we see the impact that has on immune functioning. We know that that's a good thing, but what are ways that we can get creative if group settings need to be avoided, or direct contact with a large group of people isn't safe? What are ways that we can still have
Keep
both?
that
It takes a
connection
lot of
going.
extra effort, to make that happen. But I think is really important when we're considering treatments like that.
Yeah. So let's go a little deeper. Like, how does stress impact our immune function?
Absolutely, because if we're without that sense of connection, right, what we know from a polyvagal lens is if I'm deprived of that connection, that just opens up the window for this, sympathetic nervous system, for that second branch of the vagus nerve to be activated. And so what impact does this have when sympathetic is turned on the immune system specifically? Basically, what research shows us is that when stress is present in the body, it kind of wreaks havoc on the immune system. And then that's what initial studies showed, that it suppresses the formation of new white blood cells as well as their release into the bloodstream. So not only is production down, right, but that distribution is down as well. And the time that they're present in the bloodstream decreases as well. So we see this huge drop in white blood cell functioning. As well as our favorite hormone that comes from stress is glucocorticoids.
Glucocorticoids.
That's right.
Love me
That's
some
great.
GCs.
They actually shrink the thymus gland. And the thymus gland is really responsible for a sense of surveillance and protection, has a pretty important role to play in that immune functioning. So when glucocorticoids are released, it kind of shuts that surveillance system down. And therefore the body's capacity to protect itself against different types of pathogens, antigens, tumors, that all of that is impaired, as well as those glucocorticoids also have been shown to kill white blood cells in the process as well, that they kind of take those out completely.
Evil glucocorticoids just murdering my blood
So
cells.
a lot happens for the immune system during that stress response.
So if I'm going to sort of break down what you said, glucocorticoids are released in higher instances, which can shrink the thymus, which is bad for your immune system. Also, you have fewer white blood cells being produced, and they stay in your bloodstream for shorter periods of time.
Yeah.
Those are sort of like the big three impacts.
Yeah, kind of all the heavy hitters when it comes to the immune system are kind of impaired or taken out of commission to some degree. So it has a pretty far-reaching effect here.
Yeah. Those are really big effects. Those are really big effects.
Absolutely. And so originally, right, I think the conclusion that came out of research is, all right, anytime you're under stress, it's bad. It's bad for the immune system. Things don't go well. It's always awful. But further research made us question why. It takes so much effort for the body actually to suppress the immune system, right? It actually takes a whole lot of energy to dial those things back and to attack the white blood cells in these ways, to shut down the thymus. Like, that actually expends a lot of energy. So why would the body shut that down? That makes no sense, right? Especially, we've talked so much about how the stress response is designed to equip and to mobilize our body and to keep it safe, right, in those primary stages. So why is it actually shutting down the immune system? And so more specified and kind of targeted research, if you will, shows that this response that had been detected was actually shown about an hour after the stressor was introduced.
So there's a time element here.
Yes, that the responses that we've been talking about, the reduced white blood cells, the attack on the thymus, all of those are taking place after a sustained stress response.
So that's a big difference, right?
Mm,
So your immune system can become compromised after a sustained stress response.
absolutely.
And then I'm guessing that then for the first hour, your immune system is actually enhanced, right? Usually when you have these sort of, the basic rule of the body is initially things that help you survive are actually increased. It's only over time that either they wear on you or they are decreased.
Yes, here's the immune system's plot twist. I elevate, I activate more because you need me more, right? I need to be able to, if you're cut in some way, I need to be able to send white blood cells there immediately to make that happen. And actually we see this huge boost in immune functioning up to 30 minutes after a stressor is introduced. The immune system actually is like a very key player in that stress response. The issue is, and where we see this kind of fall below baseline after an hour, is because what goes up has to come down. It expends so much energy to have the immune system in activation on full alert. It costs too much to stay up there. And so what we really see in this decreased functioning is kind of this recovery period where it's like, okay, I'm exhausted. It's like I've been sprinting for 30 minutes straight, right? And I'm slowing down a little bit in that latter 30 minutes. And then by the time that, after that hour hits, I'm exhausted.
Right.
I'm
Osmosis
depleted.
Jones has
I
been
need
running
recovery.
around for an hour and he's like, I got to take a break and take a nap.
Exactly.
Eat some ice cream.
That's really the relationships that we see there. We can't have our military on constant alert, right? And so this is kind of a break resting point for them because they can't sustain that level of activity for that long of a time.
Yeah. Okay. It just reminds me of like supply chains. It's like, man, when the system is taxed, right? Like you have less resources. And so whatever you don't already have stored up, then you have bottlenecks in any system.
Yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Maybe I'm making it too like appropriate for today though. Maybe it's not that late. I think the other thing that I read was about how for like autoimmune diseases, the fact that glucocorticoids can suppress the immune system is also sort of used to our benefit, right? I mean, the glucocorticoids are basically a steroid, right? It's a body sort of natural steroid. And so with people who have autoimmune issues, sometimes you can give them a steroid in order to reduce the overreactivity of their immune system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Because glucocorticoids are often prescribed, right, in the form of steroids by doctors, because they're saying, okay, we know that over time, these glucocorticoids will kind of shut things down and turn those white blood cells down so that, whatever is being attacked in the body incorrectly or has been mislabeled incorrectly gets a break. And kind of has this alleviation to it. That's kind of the hope behind that prescription is that we give whatever is being attacked some sort of break by dialing back that immune system.
Yeah. And also, we know from other studies that you can give the body a break through co-regulation. Can you talk about the like rhino study? I know the rhinovirus study, it's like your bread and butter.
Right. And so with that, well, and one thing too that I just want to make sure is clear of why this is so huge, right? And kind of the impact that this can have if we're not taking this space, right, is because we talk about it's too costly to have on all the time, but also the immune system is more likely to make a mistake if it's not shut off, right? And so just like, if a military or any officer defense system is, put on duty for too long, or is asked to be vigilant for too long of a period of time, that can be really devastating. That's when you see more mistakes slip in. And so that's really the risk of, if an immune system is activated for too long, the capacity to protect against and to do its usual job is impaired as well.
And can begin to misidentify threats that aren't really threats.
Exactly. We even see 40 to 70% decrease in immune functioning if there are sustained major stressors over time, that's functioning below the baseline, right? And so it's mislabeling things. It's not able to kind of get activated in the ways that it needs to. And so it's just really important, like you're saying, for what are ways that we can kind of suppress and give that sense of a break to our immune system, right? And decrease those levels of stress, right? In polyvagal theory, co-regulation offers so much hope in what that can look like.
Yeah. And I think for me, this really came home in this section on sort of like the rhinovirus. So I'll just read the quote. Subjects were exposed to the rhinovirus, which is basically a form of the cold. And more stress equaled about 3 times the likelihood of succumbing to a cold after being exposed to the virus. Prolonged stresses more than a month long that were social in nature provided the greatest threat, right? And so it's like, here you also see the opposite. It's not just that social relationships can help us feel better. It's like when we have prolonged social stressors, we can also end up feeling worse, and we're more susceptible to getting sick. And I think that's like the both end of it, because we've talked up to this point about how if you have basically our immune system can impact us in 2 different ways, right? It can make us sick by overreacting, right? And also when it's turned off, then we're more susceptible to outside viruses. And both of these ways that our immune system can sort of not work optimally are impacted by the quality of our social connections. So I just thought that that was like really powerful.
Yeah.
And it honestly kind of reminds me of like the Gottman study, right? Where they followed up with all these marriages that they knew were going poorly. And what they found out was that like they couldn't do it because, this is what Gottman says, because the men had all died. It was like, what? And he says, when people are getting high levels of contempt, right? When the relationship dynamics are negative, people are more likely to get infectious diseases and have other poor health outcomes, which ultimately leads to higher rates of death. And it's just like, well, this is wild.
Yeah.
This is wild.
Absolutely. But through a polyvagal lens, right, makes so much sense. If I'm not able to get that sense of comfort, right, and get that sense of safety and security and activate my social engagement system, then I'm kind of perpetually in this state of fight or flight. And so with that always being activated, glucocorticoids are always being released, and we see this kind of immunosuppression response because I'm not able to get out of that stress response. I'm not able to activate this other part of me that could soothe that system.
Yeah. It reminds me of my son. My son is sick today, right? And all he wants to do is like snuggle in his mom's lap and like not do anything else.
Well, yes.
Yeah, right. And I think that's sort of like the perfect sort of metaphor for what we're talking about, right? Of like, okay, if you can have it in those moments when you're sick, it actually does help. It helps.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
even if it's just your body sort of calming down and regulating so that you can actually better deal with the infection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thinking about my brother. He was talking to me the other day, and he's like, man, his daughter's 3, and isn't the most snuggly prone. And so he was like, I'm getting really nervous. She's getting really snuggly. This usually means like a storm is coming. It usually means she's getting sick. And I think I'm part of it's true, right? Of like, okay, I feel weakened in these ways. I don't feel that. And so we reach out for comfort in those moments. And I think all of us can see this too, if we've all heard a story or thought about in these moments of severe stress when I have crazy deadlines or I'm having this huge transition and now I'm sick on top of it. Are you kidding me? Right. And it just feels so overwhelming in those moments. But that link there also makes so much sense, that it's because my system is impaired in these ways, right, that I'm more prone to that sickness. My body is less equipped in those moments to fight off, to fend off the pathogens that aren't supposed to be there.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Okay, so let's talk about what I think is probably the most important section of the book so far.
All
Okay.
right.
Siegel, Sapolsky, and what we're not saying about the mind and the body. Let's talk about that. Can we talk about this?
Yes, please.
So let's talk about this. Okay.
Let's hear where this passion's coming from.
Let's hear where this passion is coming from. So there was a guy, I always forget his first name. His name is Siegel. His last name is Siegel. It's not Dan Siegel. So please, Dan Siegel, if you ever listen to this, I'm not talking about you. But I always forget his first name.
You're exempt. You're off the hook.
I'm off the hook, yes. But there was another Siegel, I think in the 80s. Mm-hmm. He wrote this controversial book about how cancer was caused by psychosocial factors, right? And can be cured by them. Basically, it's sort of like, I don't know, the modern version of like, it's all in your mind, right? And he would basically tell his patients, he was a cancer doctor, and he would tell his patients that like their cancer was the result of them having negative thoughts, was the result of them wanting to have the cancer, that if they had enough faith in the universe, that then their cancer would be cured, because we know that there's a mind-body connection, yada, yada, yada. And yeah, I don't believe in any of that. I don't believe in any of that.
And he was a cancer doctor. Like he worked as an oncologist and would share stories of these patients that were so positive, right? They had remarkable recoveries. The ones that were pessimistic and didn't look to have that faith, like they never got any better. And using kind of his anecdotal impressions of this, not backed by research or any evidence, right, that showed that effectiveness, can be incredibly devastating for patients, for families, for people that read this book. Not that we're like advocating for pessimism here.
Hey, right? I am. I know you're an optimist, but I'm a pessimist.
I'm sure you probably call it like a realism, exactly. The way you all do. But in that, right, just wanting to acknowledge, yes, there's power in that positivity, that we know that that's so important, that we don't want to take that, but we also want to be responsible in the way that we set up expectations, right? And inadvertently can assign blame if we're overestimating the role that positivity can play.
I think that you are absolutely right? You don't want to inadvertently assign blame. You don't want to indirectly shame people for this. And I think it's really complicated because around this time, there was a famous study that was done where they put people who were going through chemo into support groups. And the ones who were in support groups versus the ones who weren't, like they did have better health outcomes. Now, they redid that study, I think a few decades later, and they didn't replicate the results. And we don't really know why, right? It could be because the result was just a fluke that happens. It could be because society has become much more aware of cancer and the people who struggle with cancer. And so we're just more supportive as a society in general. We don't know why. But that study was really popular. And so it was sort of in the air. And I think it accidentally is. I don't think the study did damage, but I think the way it was handled did a lot of damage. You know,
Yeah.
Just to your point, right? Because I think if we use it as a weapon, then it becomes its way to blame people for their cancer or for their other illness, which is not. First of all, I just don't think it's like honest. You know, I don't think it's kind. Right. But also, I don't think it's true.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a
And
problem.
I think and the weight of that, and especially hearing that from a medical professional, from an oncologist, right? At times it can be a little irresponsible, right? To say, okay, it's all this, right? And I'm neglecting to mention the role that genetics play, that biology plays, that environmental factors play beyond social support. And of course, we're talking polyvagal theory, that we believe in the power of connection and the healing and redemptive power that it shows. There are studies that show that, people with the fewest amount of social connections have a 250% higher chance of death as compared to their demographically similar counterparts who are socially connected. Like, we don't want to ignore those numbers, but we also can't say that this is exclusively a matter of social support, that if you get a diagnosis, go make some friends and you'll be fine. Think positive thoughts and you'll be okay. But wanting to say,
I mean, you just saying that just sounds, I mean, it just highlights how ridiculous it sort of sounds, right? Yeah. Oh, you're sick? Go get some friends. Like,
yes.
Not.
And so, just finding what is our balance here, and what is a responsible balance of social support does, right? We see this link between the nervous system and the immune system. We see that, we recognize that, but we also want to hold in balance that that's not all there is. That's not the only thing that's influencing functioning and exposure and all of these things. So how can we hold both?
Yeah, I think Robert Sapolsky says it really well. In his quote, he says, everything bad in human health now is not caused by stress, nor is it in our power to cure ourselves of all our worst medical nightmares merely by reducing stress and thinking healthy thoughts full of courage and spirit and love. And I think that's so important for him to say, for us to say, because up to this point, we've been talking about physical illnesses. And like you've been saying, yes, there's a connection between physical illnesses and stress. But we're not saying just think positive, just, be hopeful, just have good relationships and it'll all turn out well. That's not how life works. And so I think you're right. We need to find I would say a mature view, maybe a balanced view, a nuanced view that acknowledges stress is a factor. Especially extreme stress. But let's not talk about it as though it's causative and it's a one-to-one thing, as in I have X number of stress and so now I have, this disease. Like, no, that's just not how it works.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially allowing the polyvagal theory to really guide the balance that we hold in that, and to help kind of structure the balance that we're able to hold. Polyvagal theory doesn't say, social connection and co-regulation gives you superpowers, right, to fend off any disease that might come your way.
I don't know. I mean, it might. I don't know.
Definitely not what it's saying, right? But it is saying that when I am socially engaged, that gives my limbic response, my threat response, my stress response system a break. And it alleviates the pressure in a way that it can temporarily impair functioning. So if we're able to opt for our social engagement system more often, engage in more reaching behaviors, right, instead of just white knuckling it so often, then in that case, we kind of allow some recovery time for that stress response system. We allow our bodies to return to that level of homeostasis and give it the break that it's needing so that it's able to continue to function at its best.
Yeah. You're saying that, and the metaphor that comes to me is, if the National Guard is defending the country, our best shot at winning is keeping ourselves protected. It's making sure that they're well resourced, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not they have all the resources that they need, we might still lose, might still get sick, people might still get hurt. Like, those are all realities of just life.
Mm-hmm.
But our best shot is having those sort of resources, which only come from everybody working together. This is sort of, I think, the story of World War II, right? It's like, okay, all the people started working together, and it took all of us working together to defeat this really, really like growing evil, right? And I think it's the same sort of thing here. Like, we're not saying that it's going to cure you, but we're saying it's your best shot for your body to be working optimally when you have these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that's totally true.
Right, because when we think about, when we think about like asking the National Guard, like, hey, the best way to keep us safe is to staff this 24/7. So we're going to need you to stay up all night, get up all the time, be hyper vigilant always. It's like, yeah, that makes sense, right? And that would be effective, not accounting for humanity, right? And the fact that breaks are needed and that rest is needed. And so this really is what polyvagal theory does, is allows us to embrace our humanity, right? That we need to be able to do that if we're going to be able to give our body the recovery that it deserves, so that it can function at the level that it's meant to.
Yeah. So let's talk clinical implications, Julia.
Yeah.
Can I go first? I'm really excited about this.
I can't wait to hear it. Lay on us.
My clinical implications aren't that big, honestly. But I do have two. Maybe one. I think the big thing is, I often have people come in who have high ACE scores. For people who don't know, the ACE is a trauma questionnaire. And basically, the higher scores you have, the more it's correlated with mental health issues, addiction issues, and also like physical health issues. So I often have clients come in with high ACE scores. And when I hear them talk about their physical illnesses, I actually have a deeper sense of empathy. Because to me, what I'm hearing them say is, my body, my nervous system is under so much threat. It's under so much pressure. Some of that is what it's been conditioned to do, which gives me empathy for their history. Some of that is what's going on for them present, which gives me empathy for their context and their now. Some of that is, empathy for their physical well-being, which can't help but impact their mental well-being. And so it's like, wow, like, you're really facing a big challenge here. So for me, it gives me a different and a deeper level of empathy, which I think sometimes they don't get, because sometimes people have been through a lot of trauma, and they're always sick and they're always in pain or whatever the physical sort of things are. They can sort of get pushed to the side. because the problems that they're struggling with are sort of chronic, and people keep like, ugh. And no shade on any of those people, because I know it's hard. And also for me, because, okay, your body's telling me how taxed it is, and that's a heavy burden to carry. So for me, that's sort of the big clinical implication, is taking that frame into therapy.
I think that's so valuable, especially when I think of, clients that have come in and said, like, people think I'm making this up. They think I'm doing it for attention, right? Just saying, okay, no, there is a link here, right? Allows us to have a different level of empathy and patience in ourselves. And I would say that mine is similar of, I don't really walk through like the basics of immune functioning with any clients.
You don't?
The role that plays.
Of anybody, I would assume. I think it would be you.
I know, shocking. But what I do allow it to do is for me to kind of allow it to inform my framework, right? That if this is something that a client is reporting, right? Or this is, just that there's chronic health issues, if there's autoimmune issues that are present, just having a level of empathy there of how much more, right, devastating stress can be in those moments. And it lets me know that a lot of my sessions need to really be structured around co-regulation, around sharing that burden, around how can we get other people around you to rally in this sense, right? To give, your immune system the break that it deserves, right? So it can function at the level that it needs to. It really kind of informs some of my treatment goals in working with them, that this is such a need here in order to function at optimum level, which is really clarifying, because oftentimes with patients with autoimmune or clients with autoimmune disorders or that are constantly sick, it's like, oh man, there's like this whole litany of things to go through. Like there's this list of things. Where do we start? What's helpful? So much of this is out of my control. That I think that understanding the link between the nervous system and the immune system really helps clarify some treatment goals for me as well.
Totally agree. I think it also makes me think that we really need to be, as much as we can, working in concert with other providers. Which I think is hard to do, because in my experience, oftentimes physicians don't have a lens on this. They don't have an integrated or like a holistic lens. And even in those cases, I just remember one time my supervisor, when I was back in supervision, urging me to have a client get a consultation from a physician. And that really struck me. And it's something that I've taken with me that I think is very needed. Because sometimes, because the physical impacts the mental.
Of course.
And the more stress that your body's under, the harder it's going to be to make any other sort of changes. And so I think there's a need for us, as much as we're able, as much as our job description and our level of care allows us to coordinate with other people, right? If I'm doing in-home therapy, then maybe I'm taking you to the hospital for your checkups. And if I'm doing private pay outpatient, maybe I'm just like, checking in with you to make sure that you're following up with that. I don't know. It looks different at different levels of care, but I think that's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. So just being thoughtful and intentional, understanding this link can help clarify that work there. Really well said, Jordan.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Conroy, thank you very, very much.
Yeah, this was fun. I love talking immune system.
Well, in that case, I'm glad we got to do it, and I'll see you next week.
All right, sounds good.
Hey, before you go, a few reminders. Since you finished this podcast, you might as well earn C's for listening. Check out the description to find out how you can listen and earn C's. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, if you learned something, please share this with a friend or leave us a review in iTunes. That would help us out a lot. All right, see you next week. you.